Guys, welcome to Disciple Dojo. This is the episode that so many of you have been asking about, especially over on Facebook. Those of you who follow me there or follow the Disciple Dojo Instagram page, you may have seen me posting excerpts from a couple of books that I read earlier this year, one of which was called The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, and the other was Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. Both of these are by Dr. Jason Staples. Jason and I met briefly through a mutual friend who provided me with these books to read. These are actually my Christmas present from our friend David. And he got me these. Jason was kind enough to actually sign them for me. I read them early I think it was around January when I read them. Not gonna lie, this is the best book that I have read. I mean, both were great, but particularly the second one was the best book that I've read, at least in the past 2 years, hands down. I thoroughly loved it. If you followed Disciple Dojo, if you've seen when we talk about things like all Israel, when we look at chapters in Romans 9 through 11 in our study Bible reviews, when we talk about that Israel from the beginning was always multi-ethnic, even going all the way back into Genesis, these concepts are fleshed out so much more fully in both of Jason's books. So I've been trying to get him on for a while. He's a busy guy. He's teaching. He's doing a number of other things. These books have made waves in the Pauline landscape of New Testament studies. So I knew we're going to get him on eventually. He and I kind of back and forth until we nailed down some dates that work. But I'm so excited to have him on, especially because of our last episode when we had Joey Dotson on talking about Romans 7. And now we get to flesh out some of what Paul's doing in the book of Romans, and particularly Romans 9 through 11. So this is like Romans month here at Disciple Dojo, and I love it. We had a great discussion. Jason is a fellow cultural nerd. He is all about, Star Wars and superheroes and all that stuff. We speak a common language. He's also just down the road in NC State, about 2 or 3 hours from here. And when it comes to how we read Paul, again, I've never read someone's work who I resonated so strongly with it as I was reading it. And as I tell him in our discussion, like, he's put the skeleton to the arguments that I have tried to make, not nearly as well, not nearly as extensive, not nearly as successfully as he makes in his two works, both of which stem from his doctoral work on this subject. So I'm just excited for you guys to check out this discussion. If you appreciate episodes like this, best thing you can do to help get more of them on the channel is to subscribe and enable notifications. That is YouTube's way of gauging who really wants to see this stuff. And another way you can help ensure that more of this happens is to just get word out about Disciple Dojo. Let people know. If you see a video and you like it, share it with some friends. Tell people, hey, have you subscribed? Have you checked out Disciple Dojo on YouTube? All of that stuff helps more than any ad campaign that we could ever possibly try to run. We don't run ad campaigns, but if we did, I'm sure they would not be as successful as word of mouth from people who appreciate what we're doing. So thank you to those of you who have. And yeah, no more yapping for me. Let's hear from Dr. Jason Staples. Folks, welcome to Disciple Dojo. We are here. I was telling him earlier, this is one of our most requested guests since like last year. I've had people saying, can you get Jason Staples on? You need to get Jason Staples on. You got to, it's rare that people clamor for somebody, but Disciple Dojo, we've listened to the masses. And so we have Dr. Jason Staples. He is the author of 2 books. I'm going to show them both because I read them earlier this year, both of these. So his first book is The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism. And then the follow-up that builds off of that is Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. I was gifted by a mutual friend of ours and a supporter of this channel copies of these. And Jason, I read them both. Probably the most enjoyable scholarly books I've read all year, honestly. It just phenomenal. And so I've wanted to have you on for a long time, but especially Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, which is kind of what I want to key in on today. So we'll talk a little bit about those. But first, just for Dojo viewers who don't know you, which they should, but they will after this episode. Just who are you? Where are you? What do you do?
I presently teach at NC State University. I'm an adjunct there, so lower caste in the academic enterprise. Uh, but been teaching there since 2016 when I graduated from UNC, where I did my doctoral dissertation under Bart Ehrman and four other readers as well from combination of UNC and Duke. But did my doctorate at UNC and then did a bunch of other prior training at Florida State University. So I spent a lot of time in the ACC, which seems to be breaking up. I've also taught actually at Wake Forest and at Duke. So, 5 ACC institutions and, now some of those institutions don't look like they'll be in the ACC that much longer as far as an athletic conference. So
yeah, things are shaking up a little bit. It's getting crazy.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. But yeah, otherwise, I also, since, I don't make enough money to survive really from NC State, I also work a few other jobs, including some sports media stuff and then voice work and some editing freelance jobs and things like that. So generally speaking, if it's, all but a few hours set aside for sleep, then I'm either working or with my 2 children. So not a whole lot of rest these days, but it's been good.
Well, I can imagine. And when I was at, you and I met briefly at SBL through our mutual friend David, and I remember you were speaking at 3 of the sessions, the sessions I went to. Like, you were one of the speakers. So I was like, this guy is putting in work. There's some hustle going on here. But each of them was just great. They were fantastic. And the one that you spoke at that really that made me like, okay, I need to have this guy on and talk to him, was actually the scripture hermeneutics in the Middle East session at IBR. That's the group that I'm most heavily involved with. That's an issue that's been dear to my heart since spending some time, a couple of occasions in Bethlehem at Bethlehem Bible College and with many friends over there. Arab, Jewish, Israeli, American, even Zionist, anti-Zionist, like that was an area that I was fascinated in. And you were part of a panel, and the other guys on the panel were also, most of them are people that I had known and respected. But it was really great. So that piqued my interest to talk to you. And then when our friend David gave me a copy of your books, I was like, okay, I want to take my time and really go through, because what you were saying in that session, it's very rare at SBL when I'll hear somebody saying something and every single time I'm like, yep. Like you were ticking things off, and I was like, you're saying much better than I had been able to put into words, and with more scholarly chops. What was just I think it's so incredibly important to know about what the Bible does or says about Israel and how that kind of bleeds into modern thoughts and discussions. And so how did the idea of Israel, and because that's what both of your books are about, and these were your 2 parts of what you worked on for your doctorate, is that correct? Or did I miss you?
So the doctorate, no, they're expanded and significantly edited and tweaked. But yeah, my doctoral dissertation did get into both pieces of that, and then both parts or both books revised, and for the second one especially, that's about 60% or maybe 70% of material that was not in the dissertation, stuff that was written after. The first book was mostly content that was also in the dissertation, but significantly rewritten and in a few places corrected and rethought a little bit, I think, to be stronger.
Right.
So yeah, this project goes back to the larger project goes back to 2003 when I really started the work towards what I expected to be a book on this, and it turned into 2 books, and it took me about 10, 11 years longer than I expected it to. So,
right.
I've been working on these things 20 years by the time I got the manuscripts and everything completely turned in, the final stuff for Cambridge.
Right.
So yeah, it had been a long while, and yeah, it had been going on for and in the process of learning and revision through that whole time. But the basics of it were established essentially initially in 2003 and then refined out in 2006, and then basically just sort of pulling on the thread and working on refining the arguments and things ever since then.
Right. Yeah, and you've talked about this. You've been on other podcasts and shared a little bit about it, and I'm going to link some of those in the show notes so readers can check it out, because I don't want to rehash what you've already talked about on other podcasts, and who wants to listen to that? But I would, just as like a one sentence or paragraph, was there something that got you interested in this question of how Paul views the identity of Israel and why that matters? What pointed you in that direction?
I think it was really spending time looking through the book of Jeremiah initially and realizing that there was so much there that I was familiar with from not just Paul, but some other spots in the New Testament, but Paul in particular, and realizing that a number of the places where Paul was citing that material or quoting that material, he was using it in a way that was surprising. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get to the bottom of that. It was like, wait, what? That doesn't seem to follow exactly. And so I wanted to dig into that. And then once I realized exactly sort of how that was working, it was like, oh, it's one of those things I couldn't unsee it.
Right.
It's like, oh, that makes so much more sense of how he's doing this. And then I started looking it up and, trying to see, well, who else has said this? And crickets in terms of modern scholarship. And so that's when it was like, well, somebody needs to fix this significant gap in scholarship, and it might as well be me. And as an undergraduate student, I'm thinking, yeah, I can knock this out. Oh, the hubris of youth! But
just a semester or two, and you'll have it figured out.
Yeah, I can knock this out. I can do this, but I need to get a little bit of the training necessary to do this, and then give me, I don't know, 8 years or so, 9 years, and I should be done with this, and then I can move on. And 20 years later, I'm still working through that. Things always take longer than we thought they would, and yeah,
that's a reoccurring. As I say, that's a reoccurring theme with guests we've had here on the show. Is something just starts them down. And they're like, yeah, I'll look at this for a while, and then the rabbit hole keeps going. Which I think is amazing, and it's a testimony to how Scripture can never be exhausted. Like, you can always find stuff, and then people can always push back, and that makes you go in a different direction, or makes you, like reaffirms what you thought all along. It's just that push and pull, and I liked that a lot about your book. There's a lot of engagement with the other arguments, which, of course, there has to be, not just for scholarship, but it's not a non-controversial issue. It's not something that's just like how many angels dance on the head of a pin. It matters. It has implications, and I want to tease out some of those in this discussion. But the goal, readers or viewers, I want you to be readers. If you're watching this, I want you to be interested enough to pick up Jason's books, because there is, I'm not just blowing smoke. Like, literally, it's been a couple of years since I've resonated as heavily with a book, especially with the second one, especially with Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, as I have with what I read in this. I think L. Michael Morales' book on Leviticus a couple of years ago kind of rocked my world in that same way. But this was equivalent to that in terms of reading and just being like, yes, I think I went through probably 2 or 3 highlighters worth while reading through it, just being like, note this is important, note this. And so I want to throw a quote at you from your introduction, and I want you to unpack it a little bit, because I thought it was brilliant. Your writing is scholarly, but I could tell this guy is my generation, and is culturally, we talk about cultural exegesis on the channel a lot. And there's a level of cultural exegesis you can see it throughout the book. So you say, this is your quote, it's on page, I got to read the Roman numerals, 14 of the introduction. You say, reading the Pauline corpus, which very scholarly way to put it, sounds nice and scholarly. Then you get into pop culture. You say, is therefore akin to trying to understand a meme-heavy exchange on the internet, potentially inscrutable without shared knowledge of the movies, television, or other popular media reshaped and reapplied to new contexts. I literally just saw the other day somebody shared a meme, and I knew what it meant, but all of the comments were, I don't get it. What is this? I don't get, like, and I just thought to myself in my head, like, imagine an archaeologist, like a digital archaeologist in 1,000 years, uncovering a meme and trying to explain it to a class of people. Like, good luck. Good luck getting the girl pointing and the cat at the table and be, well, there was a show about housewives, and then somebody put that with a cat, and it just, I thought that was a perfect analogy. Where did that come from? What made you make that jump, or what was the most like meme-ish thing that you've seen Paul do? You know, like some examples of that.
There's so much. Where did it come from? Well, first of all, I'm an inveterate animated GIF user when it comes to responses and so on, and unrepentant in any sort of way. I actually have a running list. You have Apple has the lists that you can do like for reminders or whatever. I have a running reminders list that I keep of GIFs to create that I've not found.
Right.
And just quickly create it so that I can add it to the repository. There are quite a few GIFs out there that, if you trace back when it was first uploaded to the internet, it'll go back to me, because I'm one of those people that likes to have something that for my circle of friends I can respond with.
Yes.
Good example
Shaping
of this.
Culture.
Good example of this. Actually, I was on a group text with Logan Williams, who I think you're going to have on.
Yeah, Logan's coming on hopefully next month. Yeah.
Anyway, he had been in he was in Rome and was texting us all like, well, airline lost all my luggage. Still don't have that, and so now I'm stuck. He's going to a conference. So a few minutes later, he texts us a picture of himself in a suit, and he says, this suit brought to you, now just purchased by the airline, whatever. And I'm immediately looking for the gift that I want, right? Which is naturally Hans Gruber saying, "Nice suit," right? This is. It's a great scene in the Die Hard elevator or whatever.
Yep.
And it wasn't there. So what did I do? The next 5 minutes were finding that scene, clipping it, getting it there, and then uploading that to the group text. Where if you haven't seen Die Hard, you won't fully appreciate the thing. You might, in that case, you'll kind of get like, okay, it's about nice suit. There's something going on here that I'm maybe missing a layer to. But if you get that that's from Die Hard, it's that much funnier.
Right.
And the other thing that really, so that's part of it. The other part, though, is that when I first started presenting this material back, I think the first presentation I had at an academic conference on this stuff was in 2006. And when I first started presenting on some of this stuff, one of the consistent objections that I would get is, boy, I mean, seems pretty subtle for just a 3 or 4 word stream of unmarked text to be so elusive in some of these cases, and you're asking a lot for the audience. And my response to that was something along the lines of, "Oh, inconceivable," right? Because all you need is one word in some cases, if it's the right word, to know, like, oh, that's a reference to. When I say inconceivable there, that really means I'm tagging this whole thing of, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Right. And this whole thing from The Princess Bride and brings in all of that cultural capital. And, you don't need a bunch if you've got sufficient intertextual volume, if you've got shared cultural knowledge, if you've got all these things. Just one image can be enough to get everybody to crack up if it's paired with a phrase from something else that everybody also knows.
Right.
And you look at the Marvel Easter eggs and all of this, so much of our culture is just relentlessly meta-referential, where it's a reference to one or two things put together that is consciously referential to something else in order to repackage that and make new meaning of it. And even in the kind of, I'm a shameless nerd. I like my comic book stuff. I like the older Star Wars stuff before some of the more recent stuff has started to try to challenge whether or not it's worth worth keeping up with. But
Preach.
but in all of these things, if you especially you look at like the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 Marvel stuff, and you're watching, and if you're watching and you have any sort of knowledge of the comic book material behind it, and I'm guessing based on what I'm seeing behind you, you would fit in the similar kind of category.
Yes.
There's all sorts of little Easter eggs in the back where there will be a poster there for something who's a character that's not showing up in the cinematic universe at this point, but it's a reference to some event that's happening in, some famous episode or some famous version of one particular comic book series. And anybody who knows this is seeing that and going, oh, look, he's got it,
Yep.
And you get that one screenshot that then goes up and everybody's talking about it on Reddit and what that means for, what they must have intended this. So this plugs into this part of the timeline. All of this stuff is done. And this stuff is done so naturally.
Right.
And so almost, it's conscious, but it's just intuitive for people who are sharing this cultural space.
Yep.
And the funny thing for me is you get all of this discussion about whether something is canonical or not in these communities, whether, is Darth Revan really, like, can we treat that as canon now in Star Wars? Should be. The old Knights of the Old Republic, the original Knights of the Old Republic video game. I don't know if you've ever played it. Is one of the best video games. One of the best video games ever created. That came out when I was in college, and my roommates and I all played through that multiple times. But and it actually might be, it's probably one of the top 3 or 4 things ever done with Star Wars, with the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, that's high praise.
And when you have these discussions of like, well, is that canonical or not? And then, okay, well, maybe it's not canonical anymore because now it's legacy canon, but then it gets referenced in some way. And all of the OGs who know that material are immediately connecting that.
Right.
This is the way that humans communicate.
Yes.
And when you have that shared material, you don't need much. And all of these things carry their own significant meaning within those cultural confines. And so for me, as a participant of these nerdy networks in the 21st century, I'm looking at this and going, these people, their cinematic universe, their literary universe, their cultural universe, first of all, overlap more than ours do, right? In the sense that they don't have as segmented they don't have as much to pull from, to where we have a much more fragmented media universe to work with, where, that person's a Marvel person, that person's a DC person, all of these different things. Oh, well, you prefer pro wrestling, or that's a soap opera person or whatever. Yeah. And for many of these people, their cultural stuff doesn't fit. Like what one person gets, another person might not.
Right.
But in a world where you are a Hellenistic Jew, there's an awful lot of overlap. That's sort of like existing within one of those canonical universes, in which there's also non-canonical stuff, but you can also reference that.
Right.
And there's this whole just massive body of material and this symbolic encyclopedia that you can pull from to make your case. And if you aren't pulling from that in different ways, you're really not making the best case to your audience. You're not participating in the discourse that everybody else is. And the difference also with them is that this is not only, the literature that they're reading for entertainment and that they're telling one another. This is also their national literature. This is also their literature as in terms of who they are as people.
Right.
This is all of those things rolled into one. And you can't tell me that somebody who knows that material and is participating in that discourse isn't going to handle things in a very similar way to what we see with the nerdiest possible members of these communities in these online spaces today. And the more hyper literate you are in those spaces, the more you're going to be attuned to that kind of symbolic use. And so for me, that was just a really natural thing to think about as I'm working through this and thinking about Paul as basically, reorganizing a few of these scenes and adding a different bit of text with it, and mixing some of these memes, I think is helpful to to think about how that works for him as a communicator.
Yeah, it's a brilliant analogy. And it was so perfect because I just last week we had Joey Dodson on. We were talking about his new book on Romans 7 and some of the allusions that Paul is making to Greco-Roman ethicists and things like Ovid and Epictetus. And if you don't know that literature, then but you only know certain doctrine, then you make statements like, well, of course, no one who's not a Christian could delight in God's law because they haven't been regenerated. But when you're like, no, that's very common among every faithful Jew and even among pagan ethicists. They regularly talked about that stuff. So there's a lot of myopia in reading Paul because people read Paul only through the lens of like Westminster or some other theological traditions, but then or they'll read through, if they do dabble in the Old Testament, they're usually reading the Old Testament, maybe the Hebrew text if they know the languages, or the English translations based on the Hebrew text. And what you do brilliantly in both of your books, but especially in the second one, is you point to all of the times where the allusions are Septuagint. If you're reading Septuagint literature and hearing the words Paul's using, he's resonating with Septuagint readers, which is what, like you said, Hellenistic Jews read. Before we get too into the weeds on Paul in particular, though, I want to back up because we've got viewers who watch this that are like PhD, in the process of PhD, and then we have some viewers who are just Bible nerdy, but they may not know anything. They've never been to a scholarly conference and never picked up a journal, but they're interested in this stuff. And so Disciple Dojo tries to be that bridge between academia and curious people in the pews. Let me just have you real quick define a couple of terms in the way that anybody can understand. Say first-year freshman students coming, Second Temple Judaism. Like, what is Second Temple Judaism? How's that different from modern Judaism? How's it different from Moses Judaism, Solomon Judaism? What's Second Temple Judaism?
So this is basically just a reference to a specific period in history that essentially, you can sort of define it in a few different ways, but normally it's basically from the building of the Second Temple. So you had Solomon's temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. You had a temple that was built in the Persian period in the same spot that then is, basically a rebuild or a replacement for that temple. That's the Second Temple. And essentially the Second Temple period, generally, if you're being technical about this, is going to start about the time that's built, about 515 BCE, and roll through the time that it's destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. Now it undergoes a lot of, rejuvenation in those some of those periods. By the time you get to the end by the time it's destroyed, and all of that, it's undergone such significant and extensive remodeling and all of that under Herod that it's almost a third temple by that point. But it's still continuous enough that generally it's regarded as a second temple. Now, for me, I'm treating it as I'm taking it a little bit more loosely because I do treat some things a little bit earlier and a few things a little bit later than that. So I'm working actually all the way back to the late stage of when the first temple was there, at least in the idea of Israel. I'm working back to a little bit earlier than that, because if you're going to look at that later period, you have to have a little bit more background. You've got to go earlier.
Right.
And I also go just a little bit later. There's some stuff that's probably into the 2nd century. So it's sort of a loosely oriented thing, but that's the Second Temple period generally. Also, you'll get people referring to that as early Judaism, which refers to the initial developments of what grew into Judaism, which is different, by the way, from ancient Israelite religion, which is happening prior to the Babylonian exile. And you have a little bit of a different relationship theologically and also with the land and with different, temple stuff. Some of the practices are a little bit different after the Babylonian exile versus before in terms of the people as a whole. And you see some significant development happening during that Second Temple period that develops into something that's more recognizably Judaism by the time you get into, say, the 2nd and 3rd century after the codification of the Mishnah. Than what comes before that. But before that, there's for example, if you're in Samaria prior to all of that, you've got people who are worshiping Baal. You've got, the notion of the God of Israel who has a potential feminine consort. Some of that stuff's not looking an awful lot like what becomes Judaism, but it's still an ancient Israelite form of religion. So you can differentiate between those.
Is it safe to say, or is this accurate at all, that the Second Temple Judaism, there arose, I mean, certainly during the captivity, but if you including the captivity, just everything after the first temple was destroyed, and the dispersion, the northern kingdom has already been dispersed, and then Judah was dispersed and taken into Babylon for the most part. Did issues of identity come to the forefront more at that point because there was not that tie to the land? And even coming back, not all Jews came back, and certainly not all Israelites, because they had been exiled before. Is that part of why identity questions that you talk about, at least in the book, started coming up then, or was there something even later that pushed that to the forefront? What would you say?
It's a good question. I mean, identity is kind of a fuzzy word. In terms of what that means. It's become one of those, and actually the identity of Israel in my title for the first book, that's not a title I chose, but it is what it is. It's a word that is trendy at this point, but it is often kind of fuzzily defined. I think before the Babylonian exile and before also the Assyrian invasions and all of that, you still had a notion of what you might call identity, in that there's an us versus other people who are not us. Right. Which is really sort of the loosest way you can kind of define what identity boils down to in this context. And there does seem to be this is who we are, associated with this particular god or set of gods. This king or that king and ruling, area, and we fight together and, band together against others who are not us. And that does, you see that in that early period. And it's basically something like what we might call today nationality. Or ethnicity in a sort of national kind of framework where, you're protecting your own land. You're identifying with your neighbors who've committed to share the same basic cultural norms and language and so on that you have. But there, even in that period, you have fluidity in terms of people who are coming in and out of that community. So, David's mighty men, for example, you have a Hittite, you have a Gittite, you have these others who are foreign, but they've settled in. They're now, attached to the royal ruling house. They're intermarrying with the group and so on. And essentially they become part of that national organization and part of the people. And so, it's there, and it's not like you don't need to pay attention to that, because if someone from outside who speaks a different language and worships different gods comes among you, they're either a threat or, either way, they're not one of us. Right. So that's already there. I do think that certain practices become more emphasized in the exile and after, because it becomes more difficult to maintain your distinction when you live among a bunch of other people. So it's one thing if you're just, kind of maintaining your common culture and common language and all of that, because that's just the people where you live, among whom you live. Right. Right. And both of us live in the United States. It doesn't take a lot for us to maintain our sort of identity politically and, culturally as Americans. We speak English, in an American kind of idiom. We both live in the United States. We both sort of assume a lot of the same cultural capital as other Americans, whether it be the kinds of movies or, different entertainment options that we participate in, the sorts of pastimes that we engage in, what kind of work is available to us. That's not stuff we have to actually worry about in terms of maintaining our identity as Americans. But if we did move abroad, if we suddenly were living in Italy or in in Germany or China or, Japan, first of all, we stick out
Yep.
as distinctively different because, I don't know about you, but my Japanese is not going to be, I'm not going to blend in.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, we are immediately different. And then we have some choices about how we want to go about things. Do I want to essentially choose to assimilate to that new place where I'm going to really work on getting the language the way that I need to be more like one of the native people that among whom I live? And, am I going to, now it wouldn't be an option, but, am I going to marry one of the local women and potentially have children that are part of that larger location, who then are going to largely speak the language of the place where they're being raised rather than the language that I came there speaking? And am I going to, observe the holidays and the norms of that community or of the community from which I came? Then you've got some decisions to make. And if you want to sustain your distinctive identity in that context, you're going to have to decide, okay, well, I'm going to maintain this amount of language in the home. I'm going to maintain these holidays in specific ways. I'm going to continue to observe, this notion of what is sacred and what's not. Those things are things that then become clearly identity issues for you. So something like the Sabbath and food laws and things like that suddenly really matter that much more for distinguishing myself. If in an ancient Jewish context, if I'm living in Mesopotamia as opposed to in the land with, a king and all of these other things, with the king and all of that living in the land, well, this is just who I am. If I'm living in Mesopotamia or in Greece or in Egypt or whatever, now the fact that I'm not eating what these people eat, and I'm taking this much of this day where I'm not doing common work, I refuse. Now those sorts of things are ways that I maintain not only my own distinctiveness ethnically and in terms of identity, but my whole family that is observing, those sorts of things and a larger community that I might be a part of in that context.
Yeah.
So yeah, it matters in that case, but it's not like it's something new. It just requires a different kind of maintenance when you're not the majority, when you're not in a cultural context where you can just generally assume it.
Right, especially if you don't have your own land with borders and you don't have, the temple destroyed, being rebuilt, and some people are out of the land, some people are in the land. You see the emphases. I think it's like the volume on those themes, I feel like, are turned up a little bit in books like Daniel or Esther, where they're all about identity. How are we faithful in exile? I mean, Ezekiel too wrestled with it. That was a big thing that in the period of the United Monarchy, maybe it wasn't as much of a concern, or it wasn't as much as something people thought of, because we're Israel, we're here, we have our kingdom, our temple, our king. And then when that's taken away, all of a sudden it's a lot like, people that move, like the example you just gave of second generation immigrant children and assimilation and all of that. And what you pull out in your work very well is that discussion, those distinctions, the concept of all Israel was already one that was in flux, was not, it wasn't people like the way Christian Zionists read Romans 11 today. Israel is Israel. It's talking about Israel, ethnic Israel. That's it. Case closed. Talking about the Jews. Israel equals Jews. You point out brilliantly, that wasn't even the case in the Mishnah. That wasn't even the case even when they would talk about all Israel, except, and then there's a whole list of exclusions. So what, for viewers who are like, I don't even know what the Mishnah is, like, what is he talking about? How would you put that to somebody, the concept of who is Israel, outside of Paul, not even getting into Paul yet, just among Judaism? What was that discussion? What were some of the things being knocked around to determine who is and who isn't Israel? Like Samaritans, they're not considered Jews, certainly. Are they Israel? Are they something else? That's a huge part of your book. So if you could tease that out a little bit for noobs who are, that's maybe the first time they've ever even thought of that question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first places to go for this is actually in John 4, where Jesus has this discussion with a Samaritan woman who asks him the question, like, why do you, a Jew, speak to me, a Samaritan? And then it's got this quote where it says, because Jews do not have common dealings with Samaritans. Okay, well, we tend to read that and look at that and go, oh, that's interesting. Samaritans and Jews are different. But if you remember who the Samaritans are and what their claims are, and to this day, by the way, there's still a very small group of Samaritans active in the land. The Samaritans are Israelites, essentially. They claim to be Israelites who are descended from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, they are rivals to the Jews who have their place of worship in Jerusalem, because as these descendants of the northerners of Ephraim and Manasseh, they say no, the proper place of worship is actually Mount Gerizim and Shechem. Go back to before David apostatized, right? David and moving things to Jerusalem is a new development. It's an apostasy that moves things away from its proper place. And they've got their own Torah, they're Torah observant. They worship the God of Israel, but they don't have common dealings with Jews. Well, that's interesting, because you would assume that if Israelite just means Jew, or Jew just means Israelite, then you would assume that worship of the God of Israel makes a person a Jew, or that those who worship the God of Israel as a rule are Jews. But in this case, you have Yahwists who worship the God of Israel, who claim to be Israelites in terms of ethnicity and heritage. They self-identify as Israelites, who do not self-identify as Jews, nor are they identified as Jews by Jews. So what do we do with that? Now, there are some options, and various options have been practiced, by different people within the Jewish community about this. Some Jews just simply rejected Samaritan claims and said they are apostatized at best. They are, bastardized and mixed in with the people that Assyria brought in the 8th and early 7th centuries, and they intermarried with those outsiders, so they're not pure blood Israelites to begin with. So their claim to Israelite heritage is rejected. They in fact are imposters who claim to be Israelites, but they're not really Israelites. That's one option. And that option is held by some Jews in the Second Temple period and thereafter. The Dead Sea Scrolls have there's a fragment, 4Q 372 fragment 1, and that particular fragment presents the fools living in Joseph's land as imposters who are, and it ties them with language going back to Deuteronomy 32, basically the not nation that God is making Israel jealous by. And they're there for the interim, and their presence there is just a constant reminder that the restoration of Israel hasn't happened, because the real Joseph is out there somewhere in exile, in chains, awaiting this other later restoration that's going to happen. And then these fools who are currently imposters in the land are going to be swept away with the wicked when all this happens. And it's tying that together to Joseph, the notion of Joseph in Genesis. This happens to Joseph in Egypt, and then he's brought to power, and that brings about, the salvation of the whole people. And it ties that to the current situation, that like their father Joseph, who was imprisoned and all of this before, now his people are imprisoned out there at present, and it ties this together. That's one option. So
that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a Dead Sea Scroll fragment.
Yeah, that's fragment 4Q. It's 4Q 372 fragment 1. Okay. And so it's also known as the older name for it is Apocryphon of Joseph. That's that no longer used now. I think it's called 4Q Narrative and Poetic Composition, which is that rolls right off the tongue.
It's a nice catchy title.
Yeah. So, but anyway, that's one option where you have, okay, they're not Israelites, but somewhere out there, the real other Israelites are, and they're waiting. So that's one option. Another option is yeah, they're Israelites, but they're not, but they're sort of apostatized, or they're not properly active the way that they should be. They should be, if they commit to worshiping in Jerusalem, then they'll be fully as they should be. Some Jews took that view. Other Jews, even into the rabbinic period, just simply accepted their claim to be Israelites and just said, well, they're Israelites, but they're not. They don't do everything correctly and as they should with respect to Torah, but they're more. There's a couple places in early rabbinic material where it comments that in some areas the Samaritans are actually even stricter than Jews. So and it recognizes that. So there's a spectrum of how that's handled. But what this does is it reveals the fact that even into the rabbinic period, there's this awareness that we Jews are not all of the people that might have a claim to Israelite status. And you have to reckon with that. So that's maybe your best entry point to this. And then as soon as you've got that, and you've got several other little pieces you can put together, you can go back to the Torah, you can go back to the prophets, and you realize that Israel is consistently seen as a 12-tribe people that eventually splits into two kingdoms, and it's the northern kingdom that takes on the name Israel, and their people are Israelites, and then they get defeated, scattered. The kingdom gets ended by Assyria in the 8th century, and the kingdom of Judah, which was one of the two kingdoms that split out of that larger unified group, they persist another 140 or so years later, and the word Jew ultimately arose as a description of people from that kingdom of Judah, and it persisted basically after that, even into the exilic and post-exilic periods, where when you're referring to a Jew, you're referring to someone who is associated with the people whose metropolis is in Jerusalem, and whose center of worship is the temple in Jerusalem. Although again, you've got Jews in Elephantine who have their own temple, but they are Judahites. They're from Judah, and they went to Egypt during the exilic period. You have some of these sorts of things that are also complicating that issue. But ultimately, to boil it down, it basically means that when we want to understand this well, we have to recognize that Israel is a group that is larger. It's a superordinate group relative to Jew or Jews, who are a subset of that larger people of Israel. And this is consistent even into the rabbinic material. Rabbinic material tends to use Israel of the present people, but it also is regularly aware that not all of Israel is represented in their communities. You've still got these other non-Jewish portions that are at least biblically there, and there's some debate about whether or not that other portion is ever going to return. So there's constant awareness of this, and there's a lot of discussion about who counts as in and who counts as out of that larger group of Israel.
Yeah, but the problem is there's not a lot of discussion on it among Christians in modern times, and the terms Jew, Judaism, Israel, Israeli, Israelite have all just been lumped together as synonymous. And so then when people are reading Paul, they don't do what you've done very carefully, especially in the second book, which is, hey, Paul's pretty specific about these terms. They are not interchangeable. And the thing is, that's not unique to Paul. That Jewish thinkers and writers were doing this very thing, but yet you will have, I debated my friend Michael Brown at Gordon Conwell on this issue, and one of his points was, every time Paul uses the word Israel in Romans 11, he's always talking about 9 through 11, he's always talking about Jews. It was just this taken for granted thing, and so therefore the payoff is when he comes to and says, and thus all Israel will be saved, then that immediately people load their theological baggage into it, and they think thus, they read it as thus all Jews will be saved, or all Israelis, modern day, will be saved, or something like that. And they miss what I think he's doing, what you, I think, argued very strongly and forcefully that he's doing is no, the all Israel is all Israel, including Jews, but not limited to Jews, because Israel was never limited to just Jews. And that's a mind-blowing or anger-inducing thought for some people, depending on
it's anger. And the interesting thing is it's anger-inducing for Christians, but generally not for Jews.
Yes.
Because for those who are familiar with the rabbinic material, this is not controversial.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not controversial to say, well, Israel is a larger group than just the people who came from Judah, and in fact, those terms are used this way. I mean, several of the more traditional more traditional Jews that I know who are really familiar with this literature, when they first read or were exposed to my work, their immediate response was, yeah, okay. Like, it's pretty obvious. Is this not? And then they realized, like, oh wow, scholarship really hasn't. Yeah, that needs to be said. Good for you. Something like that. So now that's not universal, but there are some who have suggested that I could be more precise on certain things, and great, correct it. That's fantastic. Our goal is to do this.
Right.
But yeah, this is not that controversial outside of Christian circles, where Christians have sort of embraced a view that is not native to Paul's world, and it's not native to generally Jewish theology on this.
Yeah.
So yeah, as far as you mentioned with the all Israel, if Paul meant all Jews will be saved, then my question is why he didn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's the thing that sticks out to me on this, and this has been noted by interpreters for generations. Paul uses the term Jew frequently in his Jew or Jews, and even in a few places, Judaismos or Judaism. He uses that term pretty frequently in his letters. And he only uses Israel 4 times outside of Romans 9-11, which refer to consider Israel according to the flesh, which then refers to the sacrificial stuff in the temple. Then he's got the Israel of God in Galatians 6, which is highly debated. And then the other 2 references refer to biblical Israel. Okay. And then you get to Romans 9-11, and he uses it 13 times in those 3 chapters, but really isn't using the word Jew or Jews. So why all of a sudden the switch in terminology when he gets to Romans 9-11? If he had meant, I'm talking about the Jews, he had he had no real reason to so suddenly and consistently switch his terminology here. So if he's switching his terminology like that, my argument is he's not doing it by accident.
Right.
You don't get that level of consistency across those chapters without that being an intentional move where he changes his terminology, because now he's talking about something that's not exactly the same as when he's talking about contemporary Jews in his own day. And so now he switches that language. Now we have to ask why. And my argument is that I think the best explanation for that is that he is now broadening the scope to discuss ultimately God's promises to and the fate of the larger 12 tribe people of Israel, the whole covenant people, not just the Jews who are, present and self-identified as Jews worshiping, with their worship centered in Jerusalem, part of the sort of Jewish network of synagogues in that era. He's talking about something that goes back and has a larger scope that goes back to ancient Israel, to the patriarchs, all the way forward through the exiles and to the descendants of that whole people. He's looking at that.
Right.
And as you said, the ultimate payoff of this is that when he says, thus all Israel will be saved, I think the emphasis is on the all, where it's essentially, yeah, God could have just saved the Jews, but he wasn't interested in just saving Judah. He made a promise to more than just Judah, Levi, and Benjamin.
Right.
He made a promise to the whole people, and he will keep that promise and is keeping that promise
Right.
to the whole people, which includes all these other tribes that never have identified as Jews, that were not from Judah, were not associated with the kingdom of Judah and, its after effects. Where is the kingdom of, or where is the tribe of Reuben? Where is Naphtali? Where are these others? And for Paul, if God's promise doesn't apply to them, that calls God's fidelity to his people in question.
Right.
And ultimately his conclusion, and this is the sort of final takeaway of the book, is that God's fidelity to his people Israel, and that includes to Reuben and Gad and Naphtali and the rest, his fidelity to his people and his keeping of his promises extends beyond the grave and is more powerful than death itself. That's his larger argument. And what that means on the level of the people, on the level of the ethnic people of Israel, is that even though some of those tribes may have essentially ethnically died, they're no longer, they no longer exist as a separate ethnic people, God will nevertheless find a way to restore and redeem and reunify even them within the people of Israel. So thus all Israel will be saved, not just Judah. And I think that's the case that he's making. And frankly, I think it's a very elegant case. It's not the easiest argument to make. But I think he once you start to see it and you see the through line, he makes it pretty elegantly.
Yeah. And you point back to like Jeremiah, when Paul, Jeremiah says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And it won't be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. Like, it's always been bigger than just the Jewish people. It's all that's an anachronistic
It's always been big.
term.
It's always been bigger than Judah.
Right. Those descended from the tribe of Judah. And even in Judah, you didn't have all ethnic Judahites. You had people like Caleb that were part of the tribe of Judah, that were grafted in, which Paul uses that language. And so your argument in the book, and if I'm hearing it right, and this was an interesting point you made that I was like, oh, I haven't ever thought of that, was you said about not my people, and how that phrase, the not my people, is around page 209, and then again in around page 280 or so. But you said, Israel became not my people by assimilating into the nations among which they were scattered. And then 286, 287, you said again, the logic of Paul's argument is that because Israel behaved like the Gentiles and thereby became Gentiles, now Israel's redemption includes Gentiles who become Israelites by receiving the Spirit, becoming children of God, and the promised pneumatic seed of Abraham. That's a curveball for a lot of people to think about. What exactly are you saying there? Say that again. With the Gentiles coming in, Israel became Gentile. And folks, he makes the argument well in the book, but in this, we only have a few minutes here. How do you sum that argument up in a nutshell?
Well, I think the place to go for that is actually 2 Kings chapter 17, which explicitly says that they went after the empty things and they became empty. They went after the nations around them. And what would we expect to be the next statement? And they became the nations around them.
Right.
It trails off and leaves that second part out and then just moves on to the next thing. But Paul reads that way. And the idea is, and by the way, this is about the northern kingdom of Israel, not Judah. And the same thing applies to Hosea, who is prophesying to the northerners, and he says, you are not my people and I am not your God. And I'm going to scatter you among the nations. Now, one day I will say to those who are not my people, and I will bring you back again. And I will make you my people once again. But you are not my people and I'm not your God. If they are not his people, then they are not the people of the covenant. They are not Israel. But he's talking to Israel.
Right.
So that's a hard thing for us to get our heads around in one sense, but it's there over and over again in the Hebrew Bible. And note, by the way, nowhere does any prophet say to Judah, "You are not my people." Right? Israel gets that, "You are not my people and I'm not your God." And you have a reference to that in Jeremiah chapter 3, where Jeremiah references that I gave your sister Israel a writ of divorce.
Right.
God divorced them. They're no longer in the covenant. But he says, you guys here in Judah have made your sister look good by comparison. So I'm going to call them back. And he says, turn to the north and prophesy, return, faithless Israel, because treacherous Judah, has made you look good by comparison. So you have this distinction between those two things, but no Jew at any point in history of which I'm aware would ever associate "not my people" in Hosea's promises and prophecies pertaining to that with Jews. That's just not something that applies to Jews. Jews never become "not my people" in that way. But those northern Israelites do. And what happens to them? Well, the majority of them they seem to have assimilated. As far as we can tell, they intermarried among the various nations where they were. And I think one of the things that Americans sometimes have a hard time with on this is that, and this is probably true with people from other places in the world as well, is in the modern world there's a sense of sort of your ethnicity is not malleable in any way. It's stable, it's permanent, and you're born a particular race or ethnicity, and it's just this kind of biological quality about you. And there's a tendency to hyphenate in terms of identity. So you have a family move to the United States from Italy, and they become Italian Americans, but they're Italian, and they speak Italian in the home. They eat Italian food. The kids live in the Italian quarter of New York City, and they go to the Italian parish church and all of these other things. Right? They're Italian. But the next generation, a couple of those kids go off to college and they meet, other people. And now, they marry spouses who are of German American stock. Okay, so now they move somewhere else, and their children, they speak English. They retain, the identification of, like, I'm a German Italian American.
Right.
One more generation goes by, and they marry, into, an Irish, they marry an Irish spouse. And now they're Irish German American or Irish German Italian Americans or whatever. And then another generation goes by and they marry into, somebody, and eventually, you're just hyphenating and you just never really lose all of that. But, you get to where you have, people in Congress who are saying, well, I'm Native American. I've got,
right.
Half of 1% of Native American DNA in me. Yeah, that's not really how that works, right? You're not Native. Like, it's just somewhere in there may have been an ancestor somewhere back there, but you're just American.
Yeah,
you just are. You're not Native American. You're not Italian American. You're just an American. And this happens. It only takes 3 or 4 generations for any hint of connection with a prior culture. It's gone. You're just one of the place where you now live.
Yeah. And
Israel, after the 8th century invasions of Assyria, by and large, that's happening over that entire 8th century period up to the 1st century. And how many generations is that? That's a lot more than 3 or 4. And by and large, they just intermarry and assimilate among those different nations, and they cease to be ethnically distinct in any way. They're not, this is not a situation where you have, like, Paul's going around trying to find the people who are really Israelite but don't realize it, don't know it, because somewhere there they've got an Israelite ancestor, and they just need to go and do the genealogical work enough to go like, oh my gosh, I'm actually an Israelite and I didn't know.
Right.
No, they're not Israelites anymore. But Israel assimilated among the people where they are to such a degree that God's promise now applies, not just to Israel, but to the people where that little alloy of Israel is in there. God is going to now bring people in from that people as well, because that's how he's going to access and resurrect the people of Israel from those people. Now, what that means is Israel, large portions of Israel actually become non-Israelites over time. And then what Paul's announcing is through the Spirit, there are non-Israelites who are becoming Israelites, and that this is God's means of doing what he promised for Israel.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that's also God's way of having Israel do what he appointed Israel to do in the first place, and that's be a light to the nations and lead to ultimately to be a nation of priests and a light to the nations and lead to not just Israel's good, but for all nations to be blessed in and through Israel.
Yeah.
Well, Israel's disobedience meant that it didn't happen that way, but now it's happening the other way, so that Israel's disobedience is actually resulting in the nation's good through the promises made to Israel. So this ends up being really elegant and sort of solving all of those, those promises that might seem to need to be fulfilled independently.
Right.
Paul sees them all as being fulfilled in one move with the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then the receiving of the Spirit by those who are in the nations, and also by Jews.
Yeah.
So then you have Jews and then people from the nations joined together in the Spirit. And Paul says this is Israel and Judah reunited through this pneumatic or spiritual resurrection of this ethnic body of Israel. So it's, again, it's hard for us to get our minds around, but that's how he's understanding it.
Well, he's operating at such a big picture level, biblical theology wise. He's tying in all the loose strands of all these disparate prophecies that seem to be fraying out and not going to be fulfilled. And then it's just like he just weaves them into this thing called the Messiah and his death and resurrection and the sending of the Spirit. And it's like, boom, this is the answer to everything, so that he can then make such audacious claims like, if you are in Christ, you are Abraham's offspring and heirs according to the promise. Saying that to Gentiles, people born Gentiles. And you make, in the book, you do a good job of maintaining that he's not saying Gentiles become Jews. He's saying Gentiles are being grafted back in as Israel. You on page 315, you say the point is the fullness of the nations must enter Israel for all Israel to be complete. And that is where I think some people, just coming across this for the first time or hearing this discussion for the first time, I go, wait a minute. This Staples guy, he's just preaching replacement theology. He's just preaching supersessionism. He's just preaching that, the Jews, God said, done with y'all. Gentiles are now Jews, and just replacing it and all, which you're very much not. But because people have read Israel, Jew as synonymous, I could see how they would misread your argument that way. So here's, if you want to take a chance to clarify, because I put this out on YouTube. I said, hey guys, having Jason Staples on, what questions do you have? And that was a big one, was how, in fact, it was literally, how does your incorporation view of Israel contrast with supersessionism? And then they also want to know, how does it contrast with dispensational? But I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So what would you say to that? I mean, I have your answer in the book where you actually address that, but off the cuff is more fun. So why are you not a supersessionist, Jason Staples?
So I think the first thing is that supersessionism, or at least we'll start with replacement theology, or the notion of replacement. The whole notion of replacement in this context is incoherent for someone like Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Paul is not saying, okay, well, you got a tree over here and God is moving from this tree to this tree. Or, he's ripping up this tree from the roots and then he's planting this new tree in its place. That's what you'd need for something like replacement theology.
Right.
Paul does have a remnant theology for sure, where he believes that people who are disobedient, who refuse to be faithful to the God of Israel cuts them out of the tree. Now, there are people who are adamant, who've had some pretty significant reactions against this. Kathy Ahrensberger actually gave one of the reviews of my book at SBL, and she just was incredulous at this idea that, Paul would think that there are Jews who ultimately are not participants in the final blessings to Israel. Like, no, this is just not a possibility that God would cut these people off. And I'm like, have you read the prophets? Mm-hmm. I mean, look at Hosea, or look at Amos, and look at Jeremiah and others. I mean, they've all got this imagery of God coming to his people. And specifically, you have this notion of karet in the Torah, where if someone breaks Torah in specific ways, that person is to be cut off from the people. Mm-hmm. Right? That's in there. That's in the Torah. And they're to be cut off from the people. And the prophets actually, in many cases, look back at a lot of those practices and they say, look, all of you have been practicing these things and you've not properly cut off those who are. And now God is going to come in and cut off the unfaithful. Mm-hmm. So without maintaining faithfully those things, yeah, some people do get cut off, but this is not a situation where it's like, well, the Jews as a whole, yep, leave them aside, they're done. Let's move over here to the Gentiles, and that's now the people of God. No, that is so foreign and so opposite to what Paul is imagining. Mm-hmm. Paul is saying, look, Caiaphas and some of these guys back in Jerusalem who are part of this power structure that led to the death of Jesus, and that the Jerusalem church is not on the best terms with, and other things. Yeah, those people might not have a place in the world to come. And in that, Paul is no different than the people in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for whom you read 4QMMT, you read the community rule, you read these things, and they think that the people who are associated with the polluted Jerusalem temple, who are not obeying God in the proper way and living according to the sectarian doctrine, when God sets things right, those people will be swept away with the wicked, and they will be cut off from the people, just like Paul thinks. Mm. That's not uncommon. Philo talks about how the disobedient are cut off from the tree, and then God will go out and get proselytes and graft them in to keep the tree healthy. Well, that sounds an awful lot like familiar. What Paul says, yeah. Right? So, and that's a person writing in the 30s and 40s in Alexandria, Egypt, who's not a Christian, right? So this is not a matter of replacement theology, but it is a remnant notion. And then what Paul has done is he's basically saying, now God is also, and you notice, by the way, for Philo, you have the notion of proselytes being brought in to complete and keep the tree healthy, and that God's promises still extend to them. Paul does the same thing. He just says that the means of proselytizing in this case is by receiving the Spirit and obeying the teachings of Jesus. And if you do that, then you come into this tree, and it's not a different tree, it's the same tree.
Right.
And you participate in that tree not as a new people, but as a continuation of the same people in unity with the Jewish people who are also in the same tree, because they're continuing to be faithful to the commands of God. Mm. And so you end up with something that's very different from a supersessionist notion. Nevertheless, it's easy to see how that framework a generation later gets read in a supersessionist fashion. When you have a Gentile majority church, which you don't in Paul's days.
Right.
Right? When Paul is writing Romans, he is not writing to a church in which Gentiles are the majority across, the ancient Mediterranean. He's still having to defend that Gentiles can be full members. This is a Jewish majority still, and the teachers are generally Jewish people. The question is, how much can these outsiders participate in and benefit from, incorporation in this whole thing? A generation or two later, when you have a sizable majority of non-Jews, it's very easy for them to look and go, yeah, so those Jews over there who are not following Jesus, God's left you behind, but we are the actual people that is continuing in the heritage of Israel. Yeah. And it starts to look a lot like replacement theology or supersessionism, because you've got a couple of generations, and now, couple thousand years of rivalry among different claimants to the heritage of Israel that lead to a different way of reading that. But for Paul, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think about it that way.
Yeah. I think most of the critiques, most of the kind of boogeyman scare tactics when people bring up supersessionism, which a lot of times that's how it's brought up. Not all, but a lot of times is they try to scare people, warn people away, is obviously post-Holocaust. It took on a whole different meaning, and Christians had to do some serious soul searching of what is our position towards the Jewish people, I can see why there was this almost adverse reaction against anything that hinted of anything other than carte blanche, all Jews are saved because nobody's been through what you guys have been through. That's kind of the default that a lot of Christians even today approach the issue, and I think that's why you see more of a visceral reaction against arguments like yours from Christians as opposed to from traditional Jewish groups of across the spectrum, because there's an emotional aspect to it. There's a political aspect to it, which we won't get into because that'd be a whole other episode and can of worms that we aren't going to open right now. But that's something that, like I'll just say I saw on Instagram, there was because of the stuff in Gaza, there are Jews who are vehemently protesting the war in Gaza. And that I saw a clip of other Jews telling observant Jews, you're not Jewish, because they were calling for an end to the war. So there was this, even among Judaism, there's this discussion today of your identity, your ethnic marker, your national marker. How does it fit with your politics? It's nothing new, though. It's been going on. Your quote, the 334 through 336, you said, and I thought this was brilliant, so I'm going to quote it. You said, Paul was no more a supersessionist than Philo, the Dead Sea sectarians, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the editors of the Mishnah, or any number of other early Jews who believed that disobedient, unfaithful Jews or Israelites would be cut off and not included in the eschatologically restored people of Israel. That shouldn't be controversial. That shouldn't be anything, but because of history, because of 20th century events, because of things like, inter-religious debates among Christians and Jews, horrors of medieval Europe, Europe, just pretty much at any point in the history of Europe, like there's just so much baggage. That's what your book is so important, especially for Dojo viewers. You've heard me on this episodes where we teach about this stuff, talk about some of these concepts and detaching the idea of Israel from the Jews. No, it's a subset. And Jason has done I'm not a scholar. I can't do the work that he's done to the level he's done. So I can only point people to it, which is what I want viewers to do, is to check out the work that he's done, because I think it's incredibly important, not just for your own theology, not just for your own being able to, we all want to read Paul accurately. That's a good thing in and of itself, but it has such important implications. Political, theological, ethnic, sociocultural. It matters. It matters enough to spend 20 years of your life working on. And I'm glad you spent 20 years of your life working on it. And I got to spend about 2 weeks of my life reading it. And it really was. It was there. There's so many more quotes, but we're running out of time. So maybe at some point, if you have a free another hour, we'll bring you back on. And there's stuff I want to, you have a great chapter about the vessels of wrath and what that means and what it doesn't mean. That was incredibly refreshing. You had a section about what does it mean but Paul makes this weird thing in chapter Romans 2:22. He says, you who abhor idols, do you rob temples? And I've always just read that I don't know what that means. And you point out there were the three traps of Belial, and how this was a specifically Jewish vice in Jewish lists of vices. And it's, those meme echoes, you're picking up on them because of the reading you've done in the meme background world that Paul lived and moved and had his being in, and pulling those out. There were just so many aha moments that I thought was great. We'll end with one because we have a few minutes. There's one that I think was super important, and it was the corporate nature of the tree and of salvation. And this to me was just like finding an oasis in the desert. There are not very many evangelical Bible nerds out there that aren't Calvinist, complementary, like all of that, but I'm one of the few that I know of that's a corporate election guy, that I think salvation has never been an individual thing the way it's described in Scripture. It's always described corporately. And you put it better than I could say. You said on page 188, you have two quotes, 188 and 298. You said, and I'll put these on the screen as we're going, God will always preserve Israel, but individual participation in those blessings is not guaranteed. And then coming back to it, 298, you said the promises ultimately regard the preservation of the tree and those remaining in it, not the individual branches. I loved hearing it. I loved reading it because I can't agree more. Tease that out for viewers. What do you mean by God? How can God keep his promises but not to the individual branches? What is the corporate nature of election? What difference does that make in understanding salvation and who we are in God?
Yeah, and I do think this is really important because it's hard for us, again, as moderns to get our heads around this because we tend to be so individualistic.
Yep.
Everything is about me, right? It's all about me, and did I mention me, right?
Yeah, Joey had a good line in the last episode, Joey Dotson. He's like, yeah, we just do narcigesis. And I was like, I'm going to steal that and start using it from now on.
So going to steal that. Wow, Joey.
Yeah.
That is so good.
Yep.
That tends to be the way that we do it. It's, and actually, I think in the fact that in English we've lost the distinction between the singular and plural you in normal discourse has actually been really bad for readers of the Bible because there's so many plural yous that people read as singular yous.
Yes.
They used to be these and thous, and now they're yous, and we need to convert the plural yous to y'alls or something just so that people can understand that. Now, the problem with that is that y'all implies, all of you, if we break that down, but so it's etymologically deceptive, but that's one of the hard parts about this. But, if we look at the all Israel will be saved, Paul does not say every Israelite will be saved.
Right.
That's, once again, I'm of the view that Paul tends to be pretty precise with his language. And when he says something like, well, not all from Israel are Israel in Romans 9:6, that's very tightly, very precisely written. Now, it's difficult to get to exactly what he means by that because, wait, what? Not everybody from Israel is Israel? But if they're Israelites, aren't they Israel? Aren't they part of Israel? And he's arguing, no, not necessarily, because, and then you've got 3 chapters that explain, like, well, sometimes in the potter and clay situation, the clay is not cooperating. So God finds ways to use it for redemptive ends that are a little bit different. Sometimes the tree, the branches just don't produce good fruit. So you know what? He cuts those branches off and he finds a way to graft in other branches that are going to do it. Jesus says the same thing, right? John the Baptist says the same thing, right? John the Baptist says what? Don't think that, don't say that, or think just because you are children of Abraham that, that you're all good.
Right.
Right. The axe is laid at the root of the tree. And, God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones, which is what Paul ultimately is arguing in Romans 9-11, is that's precisely what God has done.
Right.
But he also, at the same time, is saying, look, the whole concern in all of this has been for the preservation and the proper maintenance of the tree, the larger tree itself. And so when you get to Romans 9 or Romans 11, when you get to the olive tree, and you get to 11:26, all Israel will be saved. That is the final verse of the olive tree metaphor, of the olive tree analogy. That's not just independent.
Right.
So the whole thing is, how will all Israel be saved? Through the pruning of disobedient, unfruitful branches, through incorporating other branches that will be fruitful, and some of those branches that are incorporated, if they don't bear fruit in keeping with repentance and bear good fruit, then they too will be cut off, just like Paul said, so therefore fear, right? Now therefore fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Because all Israel will be saved, but he's not going to allow a gangrenous branch to infect and threaten the life of the whole people. And so it's all about the call for the people as a whole rather than for each individual. And you see this over and over and over again. Those are just a couple examples.
Yeah.
But he reinforces this all the time. And beyond that, too, the other thing that we have to remember is that election is for purpose, is for a purpose, right? This is one of those things that a lot of people have just presumed that when Paul talks about election, or when the Bible talks about election, it means election to be saved.
Right.
Like in the final, like individual election to be saved in the final judgment. But when we see election, you can be chosen for a variety of different things, right? Cyrus becomes my chosen instrument for the restoration of the people in the Persian period, right?
Yeah.
Paul becomes my chosen instrument to go to the nations, right? That's an Acts. So you have an election for something, and that doesn't always refer to salvation. That needs to be differentiated. And all too often, so many of these things get conflated where you have the people of Israel. Why are they chosen? They're chosen to be the bride of the God of Israel, and also to be a kingdom of priests, ultimately a light to the nations, all of these other things. But it's the people who are supposed to be that, the whole people. And then by the end of the wilderness journeys and all of that, did the people who were chosen actually enter into the promise that was made to the whole people? Right. The majority of them did not. Right. The vast majority of them did not. Right. Their children did.
Yep.
So we have to remember these biblical concepts and read these stories carefully, because, the promise is made to the people of Israel at the beginning of Exodus. And that promise goes all the way back to Abraham. And at the same point, only two of the generation alive, the generation who are adults when that promise is made, actually end up participating and receiving that. I mean, This is one of the things that Hebrews points out early on, saying, hey guys, all Israel came out in the Exodus, but only two entered the land. So, you also should be cautious and careful, because you don't want to imitate them.
Yeah.
I mean, these are things that, am I comfortable with these sorts of things? I'm not, that does not make me comfortable.
Right.
But I do think it's the way that this language and that this imagery is used consistently across both, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. The numbers, the wilderness generation, to me, is a great paradigm of salvation. Is Israel was saved. Israel was brought out. Israel made it into the land. Just not every Israelite. And so that leaves the calling for every person to respond. And that's, you see it in Paul throughout his letters. Well, we got to go. We got to wrap up. You are a busy, busy man, and I am super grateful. Like I said, you were one of the people I've had numerous viewers say, when are you going to have Jason on? So I can't wait to get this edited, uploaded. If folks have questions, or if they want to find out more about your work or what you're writing, what you're up to, what's the best way for them to keep up with Dr. Staples?
I think everything is basically centralized through my webpage, jasonstaples.com, which has then links to my Substack, to Twitter, where I'm active.
Yep.
I guess it's called X now by some people.
I call it Twitter. I refuse to call it X.
Whatever. A variety of different things. And there's some other initiatives that are coming soon. The Bible Pod stuff that I'm going to be doing, which will also be, I'll have another YouTube channel to add for your folks on that. So YouTube and also some podcasting as well there.
Yeah.
But all that stuff will basically be accessible through. It will be all those links are through jasonstaples.com, and then.
Okay.
That's got sort of a link tree effect to get you to all those other places. So that's the place to go for the majority of this. But I generally try to answer and eventually respond, whether it's on Substack or whatever, to people who send me stuff. But I'm pretty slow right now because I've got so much other stuff I'm trying to get off my plate.
Sure.
Stuff does get answered over time. So always happy to do that.
I will point people your way. Folks, go check out. Both of these books are published by Cambridge. The first one, Paul and the idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism. This is the preliminary. This is the groundwork. This is the foundation that then his second book, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, builds on. I'm going to say this one has more, I could see more playful titles in this one than this one. You had a lot of C.S. Lewis nods to others, so it was fun to see that cultural exegetical background at work. But I really did enjoy. It's one of the most edifying books that I've come across because, like I said, it has given the bones to arguments that I have felt and have kind of gravitated towards for 20 years now, but haven't had the scholarly ability to put that backbone to it. And you've done it. So you've done the church. You've done scholarship, a huge service, particularly with your work. I want to thank you for that, man. It's good to talk to you, hang out with you. And whenever you're working on something else and you want to get the word out to Dojo viewers, carte blanche, man. Just tell me when, and I will always have you back on. You can come discuss the finer points of the theology of Star Wars or any other nerdy stuff. We're all about that here. Superhero Seminary.
All for it.
Yeah.
All for it. Yeah. I'm happy to. I'm looking forward to being able to do some of that stuff because there's some really good stuff to be able to shoot the breeze on some of that stuff. So.
Well, you're no longer a dojo white belt. If you come back on, you'll be a blue belt in the dojo. You have achieved your rank. So, Jason, I really am. I'm super grateful. Thank you so much for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. Mm-hmm. And should I call you Shredder? Is that how this works with the dojo?
Only if I were evil. I mean, Splinter would be the preferred of the two.
Okay, so you know what? I'll go with Splinter, but you never know.
The good sensei. The turtles are actually above my shoulder, but my camera can't get as high up. So. Okay. Man, so much nerdiness. All right, brother. I appreciate it. Take care. Again, I want to thank Jason for coming on, spending about an hour and a half with us talking about subjects that aren't that easy to wrap your minds around sometimes. Jason has done brilliant work in this, and I don't say that flippantly. Go read these books. I cannot stress it enough. If you are into biblical theology, whether you're New Testament, Old Testament, they're equally New Testament and Old Testament because Paul was someone, as we talked about, steeped in the world of the Hebrew Bible. So for viewers who this is all completely new to you, check out the links that I'm going to put in the notes down below this video. I'm going to link to Jason's page. I'm also going to link to the debate that I mentioned with my friend Michael Brown, where we talked about a lot of these issues and came down on different sides of it. And I'm going to link to a video that we've done here at Disciple Dojo, which I think is the most important concept to grasp in biblical theology that dovetails very nicely with the arguments that Jason has made in his work. Not saying that that's exactly the argument he makes. I take it in a slightly different direction. If this discussion, again, it's all new and you're just kind of trying to wrap your minds around it, start with that video. It'll give you sort of a Disciple Dojo level introduction, and then pick up Jason's works for the real deal. So mine is sort of a, blue belt introduction. This is black belt level stuff. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching. As always, stay tuned for more here at Disciple Dojo. And in the meantime, keep training.